Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wisdom Chat. And my guest today is Chris Wilson, who's the Associate Professor of Psychology at Teesside University in Middlesbrough. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you very much, Phil. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. And I think the work that you're doing at the moment is particularly fascinating around the area of neurofinance and looking at people's behavior and choices around making financial decisions. Chris, would you like to just tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I'm interested in financial decision making. So that's, quite a big area, quite a broad area, and a lot of work has been done on it for a number of years. But to narrow the focus a little bit, I'm particularly interested in I guess the decisions as they're being made. So point of decision. And the perspective that I come at it from is particularly related to the cognitive effects of scarcity and of financial precarity and the load that has, so the mental load that has on people and how that might affect their decisions. And the work that I'm doing at the moment is interested in understanding what's happening both at a behavioral, at a cognitive, and at a neurological from a neurological perspective. So, for example, we might be able to examine and know that cognitive load and particular other contextual factors might change someone's decision making, might make it more risky or less risky, and so on. But then that invites other questions. So, what's happening neurologically to change that behavior? What are the antecedents to that behavior, and how can we dig in further to understand how we get to that end point? So that's sort of how I look at it from a research point of view, and then from a real life point of view, if you want to think about it that way, the prompt that I take it from is really the knowledge that so many people are living in financial difficulty, financial precarity, and that stress that puts on people is often, I think, disregarded in the conversation about how to help people. So how we help people manage their money is often focused around knowledge and information and even numeracy. And of course, those things have a place, and of course, those things are very important. But I find often that the conversation disregards the other psychological factors that could be barriers to people taking that knowledge and using it to make effective decisions.
I find that really fascinating because there's two fields I've worked in my nearly 25 years in the finance industry. One field is the investment management side, and so this understanding the decisions that investment managers make on behalf of their clients. And I suppose if they could come up with a formula that would enable them to make the best decisions every single time, investment managers would be very happy, I'm sure. And then the other industry is the money and debt advice side, and understanding what drives their behaviors, which you're right, Chris, are not necessarily being picked up. You talk about knowledge, info, numeracy. These are the very things that they mainly focus in on. However, the psychological, the emotional side, the drivers that sit behind that part that cause people to make decisions. I think about my own situation many years ago. I found myself in a sizable amount of debt. Yes, I made some poor choices, but also I suffered certain experiences like redundancies over a 3-year period. 2-year period, 3 redundancies over a 2-year period. And the impact that had on both myself, my wife, and as a family as a whole was, you don't forget those things. And I'm sure those experiences will now drive some of my choices now without me realizing, unless I stop for a moment and think about it. I would imagine that given our present circumstances as a society as a whole, these are some of the things that are really driving your key interests.
Absolutely. So, if we think about, for example, the effect that the uncertainty uh, of around financial security might have on somebody. It means, for example, that at a basic level, they have to spend a lot of their mental energy planning and organizing how they're going to get through the week and then how they're going to get through the month. And so research has shown, for example, that there's even an effect for people who are in that situation as we move towards payday. So as we get from payday initially reasonably okay, but as we start to get towards the end of the month, within about sort of 4 days or a week of payday, suddenly the cognitive and mental energy to balance the resources that they have with the things that they need suddenly becomes quite large, and that causes stress and worry and fatigue. But it also affects other things that we might not instinctively be aware of, like planning effectively, and it increases your likelihood of making impulsive decisions, for example. So those are things that's just the basic effect of scarcity on
Yeah,
people. And if you imagine having to deal with that for a long time, as to going back to what you mentioned, those habits, those things that we're not necessarily aware of, then might become our defaults, might become our ingrained within us. And then, of course, those are the things that have to that sometimes people can't shift when their circumstances change. So then people get money and then they're actually fine, but the effects from their previous experiences continue on.
yeah. It reminds me of, I mean, it reminds me of a number of clients I've worked with where they've talked about their past experiences as a family and family members and what they instilled in them. So as youngsters growing up, we're very much influenced by those sort of in authoritative positions around us at the time in our developmental period. And during that period of time, I remember one client saying to me that she had an aunt who used to say to her, "You must save." And when she grew up into adulthood, this same sort of trigger of I must save, actually, on the one hand, people would say is really good. But on the other hand, actually became a real negative because she didn't feel comfortable in spending, felt guilty and ashamed, and letting a family member down. And I would imagine that, when you're talking about these drivers or triggers, these things that we take on board as behavior that we may not necessarily think about, but the moment somebody stops us and then highlights it, suddenly we become aware of and think, right, I never thought about that might affect how I'm dealing with my money here and now. But it happens even in the money and debt advice world, and yet we don't tackle that side. Is that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's what you gave is a good anecdotal example of how, even going back to what we talked about earlier, just giving people advice and giving people information might seem intuitive, but depending on the context, depending on how it's received and how it's processed, and as in your example, might not actually have a beneficial effect. And it actually, if you don't mind me going into, is related to a study that I'm running at the moment. So if we one of the mechanisms through which we can process information is called construal. So you can process information at a high construal level or a low construal level. And high construal level is about why you might want to do something. So you can think about that as your values. I want to do this because I will achieve this at the end. And low construal is about how you would do it. And when you process information in a low construal way, it becomes almost a series of instructions, things you have to achieve. So we can imagine, and obviously we're assuming, but we took your example and we pushed that on, that your client was maybe processing it at a low construal level. Not let's focus on why I'm saving and why it would be beneficial,
Yeah.
but let's focus on the fact that I have to save and how I have to do it. So that potentially through your anecdotal evidence became a negative thing, but actually in the study that I'm running, that's one of the things that we're potentially finding. So in one of the studies, and bear in mind, just for your listeners, I'm an experimental psychologist, so I do studies in the lab. So I take very small pieces of behavior and measure them very precisely and then try to relate them to real life. So I'm not working with clients and I'm not a clinician in that way, but we try to map, if you want, onto real life behavior. So, and in that study, we found that presenting people who are under cognitive load that we'd induced or I'd induced in the lab, when you presented them with low construal instructions where they focused on how they needed to do something, that in the end, when they were doing subsequent tasks, financial decisions became riskier. They were more likely to make riskier financial decisions. And that's an interesting sort of example of what you talked about anecdotally potentially happening in the lab. And the follow up to that that I'm working on at the moment is to find out neurologically why that might be happening. So
Yeah.
using a mechanism called FNIRS, which measures activation in different brain areas to see what's happening in the brain during the decision making process.
That's tremendous. I just remembering this particular client. One of the things that she said to me right at the end was, "I manage my money well. However, because of this idea that if I spend it, I'm letting my aunt down. If I spend it, I feel guilty and ashamed." She says it just drives my stress level, and she's constantly living with this high level of stress. But one of the things I always say, how do you know how to get to a destination unless you know where you're starting from? So if you think about our psychology, our ideas, our beliefs that we have around money, unless we know what they are and what our values are, then really we are very much influenced by those things around us or by the past triggers. And it's interesting how you're looking at individual things and sort of loading your test subjects in that way, so you can get to see how they respond, or the kind of response or behaviours that they display, or the mindsets that they may have. Obviously, in the wider world, we don't have that facility in a sense, and when you're sat talking with people who have found themselves in financial difficulty, and you're talking about ways in which to get them out, most will say to me, "I thought we were going to start with building a budget or a plan of some kind, but you've started with money psychology." And I said, well, it's to do with that journey. You might know where you want to go, but how do you know how to get there if you don't know where you're starting from? And it's understanding where you're starting from, so understanding you. Would that be a sort of a good sort of description in some respects?
Well, even if we broaden it out a little bit from the individual values to societal values more generally, there has been some work, and this is one of the papers that I read that got me really sort of thinking about this topic years back. So by a chap called Kasser and his colleagues, in I think it was 2007, and they published a paper that looked at the fact that psychology rarely examines the effect of the broader economic system on people's lives. So the fact that we have to, for example, accumulate wealth and accumulate status, and those things are associated with growing up and becoming a person and becoming independent, and they're all intertwined with essentially what you're supposed to do with your life, right? It's part of what you're supposed to do and who you're supposed to become. So those are supposed to be your values. And what they started to look at was actually that when you take those things in isolation, so the focus on advancement, the focus on gaining wealth, the focus on, if you want, power, although that's sort of secondary, they are in a way slightly the opposite of what we also tell people that they're supposed to be doing, which is the focus on community, the focus on family, the focus on other things. So we have these in theory values that are all supposed to happen as part of a successful life: community, family, but also wealth and achievement and promotion and so on. But actually, in terms of what they really are, they're almost opposite to each other. And so it's not strange in that sense, they argue, that people develop conflicts about money and wealth and how it's supposed to be managed and how they're supposed to deal with it, whether they have it or don't have it, because of the fact that the messaging from a societal point of view is quite mixed still, and it's and when you embed that then with personal experience, it becomes quite a complex thing to navigate for some people.
Yeah. I'd say what will be interesting on this, Chris, and I'm not wanting to get necessarily into politics in any way, but it's interesting what's happening at the moment, and the thought process and decision making at a very senior level in our country, and the viewpoint of the I suppose financial distress that more and more people are now experiencing because of the rising costs of living and so on. That there's a lot of call for government to do, X, Y, Z, whatever those may be. And I'd be interested to know, taking what you've said and looking at it in a sort of a top level, sort of wider perspective. They're often the ones who drive the attitude within our nation. We've always been told by whatever government, we must save. We need to be a nation of savers, which is fine if you've got money to save. But if you're like many people who are working 2-3 jobs and they're just managing to make things ends meet, then that's one of those things where you think, well, am I going to be poorly judged? Am I one of the bad ones in society working with money? So I just wonder, what would your take on what you're hearing and seeing going on, and what's being driven from the top with regards to, or in addition to your work?
Well, I think it's always important as a researcher that you remain apolitical, really, and that you don't react to whatever's happening at a policy level in some ways, because you can't have your work driven by ideology. So, not sidestepping the question, I guess, but if we reflect back on what we talked about earlier, which is that in the conversation generally, it seems to focus a lot on what people should do and how they should, change their, change their behavior and save and this is how you restrict your electricity output and so on. Perhaps doesn't necessarily acknowledge that it's easy to say that without accounting for all of the other effects of just being in those circumstances has on people.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important at all levels to acknowledge the psychological effects. And people listening to this who are psychologists and academics might be shouting at the audio device saying, well, we have studied it for years, and yes, we do, and we have. It just depends to what extent those things are being adopted in the domains that they need to be adopted in. Is what I'll say in that.
Yeah, I think the you mentioned earlier when I was talking about this particular client being told to save, and oftentimes people not knowing why they're doing certain things, they're just doing them because they think, well, this is what's expected, isn't it? I'm expected to save. I'm expected to make wise decisions and so on. But you're right. On an individual basis, we don't necessarily take account of their own circumstances. And also at the same time, it's one thing to say to people, you must do X, Y, Z, but that would be great if we were all the same. But we're not.
And this is not an area that I have extended expertise in, so I'll mention it in passing just as out of interest for people. But it immediately starts to get into, and what I'm interested in is the idea that financial decisions and monetary decisions are not all about money, and they're not all about maximizing value, because people don't think in those terms and aren't aware of those terms. They're about all of the psychological factors that are stopping us essentially from maximizing value, if you want to put it that way. Because if we could do that automatically, we wouldn't be people. And so that then links to things like mental health, right? So to what extent are a lot of people's mental health problems partially impacted by financial worries? If we know that scarcity affects stress and it affects worry and it induces fatigue and it stops people eating properly and it stops people sleeping, then to what extent would mental health problems be alleviated if financial problems were alleviated, and vice versa? So the psychological discussion around money and finance is endless, really.
Yeah, I tell you, just a thought in there as well, because I have dealt with people who have got money, and one of the things that's really surprised me, and perhaps I ought not to have been surprised, but how those people can worry about money. And it's interesting. There's a really good book by a guy called Peter Koenig called The 30 Lies About Money, and it tackles the issue of, if you say money to somebody, what's the first word that comes to mind? And people will say things like happiness and power and control and security and choice and freedom. And there's a whole raft of words that they could use, as though money has a power to give them that particular thing that they're desiring. And I said to somebody once, if money could give you happiness, oughtn't it be true that more wealthy people are the happiest people on planet Earth? We don't have to look too far to find still a lot of unhappiness. And so it's almost like we're attributing to money a power that we think it has, but we don't realize. It's like projecting onto money something that we desire. Is that something that you've come across, not just with the scarcity?
Mm. I mean, it's not something that I can speak to in detail because I don't want to overreach, but it's certainly,
Yeah,
at least at a basic level, links back to what we talked about values and the need to, you would imagine that to achieve a large amount of wealth takes a lot of focus.
mm,
There's only so much time and in the day you have to be extremely driven and so on. And anybody in any discipline where they have to be driven and focused has to do that to the exclusion of other things.
yeah,
But there's always potential there then to get to a certain point where the exclusion of those things suddenly comes to the fore. People become aware of that,
yeah.
and we can make some assumptions then about what might be a consequence. But I couldn't speak further on that because it's not
No,
my
no,
area of
no.
expertise.
I appreciate that, Chris, as well. One thing I was thinking there is going back to the sort of financial decision making, including professionals like investment managers and so on. Do you think that things like fear? So we've already said that sometimes our own experiences can build within us a certain belief structure that can influence our decision making in other ways. But do you think that fear can play a huge part? And the reason why I'm just asking that is I've come across people who they do things, and when you get to the bottom of it, there's like for example, a fear of lack or a
Mm,
fear of
mm, mm.
scarcity, as you've said. Do you think that plays quite a significant part?
Oh yeah, I mean, strong emotions can have a huge effect on even in the moment decisions. As I said, that there are the things that I focused on. So, there are lots of effects that we call them, where essentially we're describing reasons why people are not making the most logical financial decision. And one of them, for example, is a framing effect, whereby if something is framed in terms of a loss, that will have a different decision compared to if it's framed in terms of a gain, even though the outcomes are functionally identical. They're the same outcome, but they're framed differently. And that can be that effect can be magnified or reduced or modified by emotional states such as fear. So I've seen studies, for example, where they induced a fear-like state in someone, and suddenly their decision making changed completely,
Yeah,
um, even with the framing effect being presented. So, um, absolutely, emotional states like fear can compound things like in the moment decisions, but also things like future discounting, which is a feature of sort of longer term decision making. How
yeah,
we discount the value of future um, gains and losses and so on impacts what we decide to do now. And if your present emotional state impacts on that, then that's obviously going to have an effect. So yeah, you can imagine certainly strong emotions like fear driving decisions.
yeah. In terms of your work, Chris, what would you what's kind of the end goal in terms of what you would like to see happen as a result of the research that you do? And also, I was just thinking as well, um, are there opportunities for people to support you in your research, to assist you with things that could perhaps help the wider society?
Yes, absolutely. So I'll talk about maybe collaboration and partnership first. I'm happy to work with organizations or people who have an interest in financial decision making at that sort of point of decision, if you want to call it that. So a lot of work is done on stocks and shares and portfolio investment and other things like that, and that's fine, but that's not the focus that I'm interested in. I'm interested in sort of individuals and how their psychological state could change the decision. So anybody who works either if you might work in the third sector with people who do experience deprivation, or on the other end of the scale, people who are wealthy and well off, but they have similar effects that we might want to come at it from other angles. It's very important for me to try to have work that's as ecologically valid as possible. So
Yeah.
that what we mean by that is that it matches up with the real life experience. So it'll always be experimental and lab based and very controlled and precise, so we can have a confidence in the effects that we're seeing and understand the causes. But if we can do that with groups and individuals who are experiencing the circumstances that we're trying to explore, that's obviously more valid. And also to hear from those people and groups what the concerns and questions um, are that they have, or what's coming from their end, because we don't want the work to be driven purely theoretically and hypothetically. We want it to be based on real life. So to give you an example, and to link to what your other question was about what's next and what's the end goal, what drove the project that I'm working on at the moment was that idea that people are being told how to manage their money. So that's the idea that education is the solution. And the research is very mixed on whether it works or not, which just indicates really that it might depend on the circumstances. So the question became, well, what are the circumstances under which it might work or not work? It might become effective or ineffective to tell people to do something. And so that's what drove a focus on how the information is being presented. And so the immediate goal is to explore that through a lot of different avenues. So there'll be a lot of different studies focused on different aspects of how we present information. But one of the other things that I'm interested in is types of credit products. So credit products are always changing, and people are exposed to new types all the time, whether it's the advent years ago of online products like PayPal and so on, but now the explosion of buy now, pay later. And the questions around them is they might not necessarily prompt the same internal, if you want to put it this way, warnings that people might normally experience. So people know a credit card is a credit card, and whether they make a decision or not, they at least have some sense of risk. As the products change and evolve, they don't necessarily, or they might not necessarily set off that neurological warning sign in the risk part of your brain, if you want to put it that way. And that's something that I'm particularly interested in as well. So that's a next question.
I suppose, Chris, then, if there are organisations or representatives of some of, like, for example, the money advice organisations that I've worked with over the years, and there's been quite a few, and they are tremendous organisations and do a fantastic job. But the one thing I know about them, even from my own experiences, they often gather data around the effects of indebtedness, but don't necessarily look not just at the causes. So they might have information like, for example, breakdown of relationships causes indebtedness. Mental health issues may cause indebtedness, and vice versa as well. So they'll have information about that, but they won't necessarily have information, because they've not looked at it necessarily, about the psychological impact that people have taken on board unconsciously and subconsciously over the years, from their developmental years to the present day. So they won't necessarily have that information. But I would imagine that some of these organisations will be great for you to talk to, because they would be able to put some real life evidence behind the laboratory research that you would actually do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you described, for example, the idea that somebody might have been in debt or had experienced indebtedness, and then the end point is, as you said, a breakdown of a relationship or some sort of consequence. And the idea with research is always to fill in the gap. So I would describe it as looking at the process. Right? We know the start point, but we know the end point. But what was all the stuff that happened in the middle, and how can understanding that help us help people more in the future? And
Yeah.
so there are many ways we could do that, whether it's, complex lab studies, but also just through exploring a little bit more detail, through psychometric measures or questionnaires. It doesn't have to be invasive on the client. It doesn't have to cause them more stress or strain. There are ways that we can do it. And the goal is, as always, to try to find answers that can help us help people. And at the end of the day, the hope is that the research that we do in an academic setting reaches people who are making policy, who are working with clients. So if we can involve them as early as possible, all the better.
So, Chris, then, if and I know we're run out of time now, but if people want to contact you and would like to talk with you further about this, say some of the organisation I'm thinking of who are involved in the money and debt advice world, they can also advise you about the sort of the developmental stages of products from, like you mentioned, PayPal through to the present day buy now, pay later, and everything that's sat in between. How would you like them to contact you? How would you like them to get hold of you?
Sure, yes. So they can find me obviously on the Teesside University website, but you can also contact me at christopher.wilson@tees.ac.uk. Or if you Google Christopher Wilson Teesside, you'll probably find my personal website that has a contact form there. So anybody who's interested in this topic and again wants to focus on trying to find ways to understand it more, to help people who are in financial difficulty, that's the goal. So just reach out and have a conversation.
That's fantastic, Chris. I really appreciate your time. A fascinating subject, and one perhaps we could explore far more about it than we're able to do at this point in time. But perhaps we could have a chat sometime in the not too distant future and see how things have progressed, what we're facing as a society at that point, but also what you've discovered in that period of time, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, sounds great.
Thank you very much, Chris. You take care.
Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye.